About a month after I published my response to Steve Shiv's video on 5 stupid things about the 9/11 truth movement, I was rewarded with a visit from the man himself. Apparently he had been pressured into confronting me by his fans. They didn't want the scuff mark on his spotless record to go unchallenged. I give Stephen credit for having the gall to do so, even if the manner in which he went about it was rather half-hearted. The argument that ensued was an exciting free-for-all, with many individuals coming and going. I did not hesitate to lay them flat, in between my sparring with Stephen. At the outset of the argument, I offered an opening statement which turned out to be prophetic. Stephen's main concern was the failure of the scientific community to reach a consensus in favor of 9/11 truthers. He asked, if a junior high-level understanding is all that is necessary to verify the truther claims regarding the tower collapses, why is it not a single academic or scientific body has ever agreed with these claims? My answer was, if a scientific institute took up issue with the official story, they would be ridiculed, stigmatized, and under pressure from peers to retract their support of 9/11 truthers. Credibility, respect, plausible deniability, and the bottom line take precedence over the hard truth. Stephen rejected this, of course, which mattered not, because whether or not the scientific community deigned to admit the disquieting phenomena present at the World Trade Center was irrelevant. These things had been objectively measured to exist, independent of some observer's personal stance, which was a point that Stephen seemed unable to grasp. In his mind, if scientists don't acknowledge it, it doesn't exist. That is the same kind of logic Christians used when confronted with the Copernican revolution, rebuttals which were based around the authority figure's refusal to observe undeniable facts, which would have exposed their corrupt foundations for all to see. The priests chose not to look into the telescope and see that the geocentric model was wrong, for fear that it would make them a heretic. But their denial did not change the reality that Earth did, in fact, orbit around the Sun, and not the other way around. Copernicus' research uncovered a very uncomfortable truth, which was repressed by the establishment. A conspiracy, in other words. So, like it or not, there are historical precedents for these things happening. In the case of September 11th, the layer of deception and complicity is merely one extra step removed. Scientists themselves were not the perpetrators of the cover-up. Rather, they are highly dependent upon the state operating system and had many surreptitious motives for not speaking up or getting involved. Anyone who enters the scientific community is groomed and molded in such a fashion that they will not cause overt disturbance, and those few that do are thrown under the bus, just like Professor Stephen Jones was when he made his Ground Zero report public. The overarching point that would-be debunkers like Stephen refuse to acknowledge is that 9/11 was not the result of a few shadowy figures with malicious agendas. It was a product fabricated by an entire civilization, which has been corrupted to the core, aching for a pretext to institute a sweeping new policy of aggressive imperialism and crony capitalism. These false flag attacks were the greatest staged events in human history and served as the centerpiece for the PNAC strategy to mobilize the full resources of the US superpower. This is no different than when Hitler had the Reichstag burned down and blamed it on his political opponents to seize absolute power within Germany and set himself up as dictator. But they ignore all these things in a deliberate attempt to misconstrue our story into one resembling a Hollywood movie plot. Ignorance of historical precedents for events like these is one of the hallmark traits of today's generation of pseudo-skeptics, as is an appreciation for physical evidence and reasoned logic. They instead rely on nonsensical memes and rhetoric which denigrate the opposition, as well as arguments from authority and begging the question fallacies, proving what is not self-evident by means of itself. This is the crutch of the intellectually lazy, who puff themselves up with delusions of grandeur. A further mistake of their blatantly unidirectional skepticism, only casting doubt on those theories which are opposed to the popular interpretation. This double standard severely reduces their credibility. A true skeptic would be doubtful of all positions and take a stance only after sufficient evidence has been brought forward in support of one's side. This entails a vigorous exposure of all aspects of opposing theories, rather than a cherry-picked interpretation. If you begin your inquiry with such a bias in mind, you have already failed. This is a mistake that many debunkers make when they spend most of their time investigating the dubious claims made by no-planers. Now, continuing on with the debate, while persisting with his obfuscations about how subjective conclusions can be every bit as valid as objective conclusions, Stephen demanded that I conjure an alternative timeline for the 9/11 attacks. This was a rather silly request, and I informed him that there was no sense in worrying about our timeline when he doesn't even agree with the general story. One must learn to crawl before they can walk, and some pounding into his head of basic facts was in order. Stephen continued on in this fashion for some time, trying to water the discussion down to why he should not believe in the official story. For the record, I had no intention of exploring things as subjective and temperamental as human belief. All that can be done in issues such as these is to measure and quantify the objective evidence, not delve into the minutiae of perception. Fortunately, after some persuasion, I finally convinced Stephen to try his hand at this. He denied that there was any molten steel present at the World Trade Centers, instead saying that it was molten metal. The theme that was made implicit with this bait and switch was that the metallic substance in question could have been aluminum, which is known to have a much lower melting point than steel. This would have the clever effect of lowballing the temperature estimates at the World Trade Center. Problem is, molten aluminum is silver, not orange. What's more, when heated to 1,000 degrees Celsius, everything glows. Steel, copper, aluminum, even refractory insulation. And this is a temperature range that no office fire can supply, which hints at the presence of thermite. Stephen insisted that the abundance of jet fuel present would have been able to raise the blaze's intensity. But by duplicating a simple bit of math that had been done on another website, I conclusively proved this to be untrue. and the laughter of Stephen's denials rang hollow. He then tried to slight my debating skills, and when I responded that flea bites have had more effect than his hit-and-miss attempts at argument, he had the gall to claim that I was being condescending. All I have to say is, don't go down a tangent that you aren't able to win at. After having been refuted and argued to a standstill on most of his topics, Stephen decided to cut his losses and withdraw from the debate, but not before leaving a petulant comment to cover his retreat. Among other things, he sarcastically said, "As if anyone who isn't a member of your clutch of fringe paranoiacs is an ignoramus." My honest response to this was, politically speaking, they are. Those who don't understand that democracy and consent are a manufactured lie aren't even in the game. I have been in many debates during my time on YouTube. It is a thrilling activity that I have gotten very good at. I love the rough and tumble, non-structured nature of arguments in this medium. There is a lot of misinformation propagating itself through the internet, and I see it as my own personal duty to filter out the really bad stuff. stevelikes2curse has been the largest YouTuber I have defeated to date, and was an important hallmark in my online career. It just goes to show that Bill Maher wannabes are no match for physical evidence and reasoned logic. Though with all that said, I still respect Stephen's initiative in coming to debate me one-on-one, and thank him for the extra views he brought in. I would be happy to have a rematch with him in the future, and give Stephen a chance to avenge his loss. It is, after all, the gentlemanly thing to do.